Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Lynn, and I'm part of the talent branding team here at Miro. And I'm very excited to introduce you to today's speakers, Dan, Keren, Roger, and Juan, who will walk us through how they have redefined collaboration using Miro. After each presentation, there will be a couple of minutes for questions. Please add any questions that you might have in the bottom bar here in the Q&A tab. And that will make it easier for us to keep track of all the questions that come in. We will also save some time towards the end of the meetup for any additional questions that might pop up. But for now, I'll hand it over to our first speaker. Dan, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you to Miro for hosting this, for Juan and Lynn for all the coordination they've done so far. I'm going to share my screen here. I'm Dan Singer. I am a product researcher at Stack Overflow. Today I'm going to be talking about crafting co-creation research. So co-creation is a design method that's used a lot, and some of our other speakers I know will be hitting on that today a little bit. And we're going to talk about how we used it as a research method for using Miro. I also want to call out that this talk was co-authored by my colleague Mithla Fox, who is in Australia, and I think it's 4 or 5 a.m. there, so she could not join us today. But I just want to credit her for her involvement here as well. For those who are not familiar with Stack Overflow, it was founded in 2008. It is a forum, question and answer forum for developers to ask questions about how to build it. If, like me, you've ever wondered, like, how do I center something with CSS? And being someone who's not a developer, you've probably ended up on Stack Overflow at some point or another. It has a long history of being built by developers for developers. There's a really strong developer culture there. But over the past 13 years, we've continued to push it a little bit and see where we can stretch it to meet the needs of an extremely large community. So we were approached this year with a couple of challenges. The first being, what might it mean to build knowledge on our platform outside of the Q&A format? So the Q&A format has worked really well for a very long time. Someone comes in, they type a question, experts answer that question, people upvote the answers that seem the best. But we know from research that some folks have trouble participating in that format. Some folks can't answer questions, even though they would like to answer those questions. Some folks can't ask questions the right way. It sort of ends up getting downvoted because they've not asked that clearly enough, or their question has been asked before, even though they don't know it. So we're always looking for ways to sort of expand what it means to participate on the site. And we do know that there is a big interest in actually forming a community. So bringing people together based on their common technical interests. We know that there are a lot of things that meet that in some ways right now, but we already know that so many developers are on Stack Overflow every day to help them with their jobs. And so we have these are big questions, right? These are really open-ended questions. And whereas typically we might approach those by running research interviews. We might get one-on-one with 10, 15 people, ask them, go through a discussion guide and get at these questions. We were worried that we might be focusing too specifically here on one person's experience, limited experiences, and not actually exploring the space enough. And so we turned to co-creation as a method, as a way to kind of create a space that could be easily manipulated by all participants, easy to create. This is something that typically we would do in person with a whiteboard or crafts supplies, all these sorts of things. And I mean, a lot of our attendees here have probably been in all-day workshops where you get scissors and you get to kind of be a first grader all over again. But we're remote. We're remote because of COVID, but Stack has always been a remote company. We've always conducted research remotely. And so our challenge became how to do this remotely. And we turned to Miro, which we have used very significantly for workshops within our company. And that's, I feel like every month we have another workshop. People are continuing to evolve on the platform at our company, but we hadn't used it for research yet before. And so what I want to talk through today is how we turn to Miro to help us facilitate answering some of these really tough questions. In order to sort of approach this from a more holistic way, we recruited a wide panel of folks. We ended up with, I think, 15 or so people, and we split them across 6 sessions in small groups. So we had groups of 2 or 3 people together. They had not met each other before. And we pulled them together in Miro, and we said, we all had our cameras on, and we said, we're just going to go into this. You're just going to have to trust us for a little bit. And one of the ways that we started opening that up was we started with an icebreaker, similar to what Lynn did today, to get people in Miro. We started with this, we call it Monsters Inc., but it was adapted from a Miro template called Monster Workshop by Nina Tori. You can find it on Miro's website, where you have a bank of, everyone has a bank of like pieces, and we all built monsters, and sort of, it got people using the tool, familiar with copying and pasting, moving things around, manipulating things. And it also kind of helps to just loosen things up, get everyone to know each other, help everyone get to know each other a little bit. And just kind of get everyone a little hands-on and say to them, hey, this Miro board that we're on, this is your space too. You can do whatever you want with it. We, of course, also, as the facilitators, it was myself and a designer. We participated with them. And one of our favorite things was to chronicle our monsters over the course of the sessions. And I'll bring that here just because I think it's important for everyone to share. I think my monsters really sort of turned sad when I looked at them in retrospect. And Vivian's definitely got a little more abstract. She was definitely exploring some really strange territory. But after we had that, we had this icebreaker, we got everyone in the tool a little bit. We realized that whereas we're designers, we're very comfortable with just jumping right into things. We can manipulate stuff. We're more familiar with the blank page. The people we're working with are not. And so we started with a brainstorming just to help kind of prime them. We asked a couple of questions. We wanted to help get them in the right mindset, because what we were building together is a conversation, right? The ultimate goal of what we were creating was not to get a bunch of ideas that we can just go build right away, but it's to facilitate a conversation. And so to facilitate that conversation, we started building and seeding some of those topics. So some of those questions we asked are like, we're asking questions about community. We asked, what kind of communities are you a part of? What makes those communities special? What makes them safe or comfortable? What would you change about those communities? So we started sort of having this dialogue here. Sticky notes, something that's super familiar to them, started just building up and getting them in that space before moving to that blank page, right? And saying, okay, now I'll take this challenge. We made this blank space. We've talked about what makes a special community. What are the ways in which we can actually create that community? And we set everyone off. We had a couple of prompts, but we started talking about, well, what are those things that are really useful? As we started this, originally, we just put them on a total blank page, and we found people, they could not get going. And so honestly, all I did was create a square. A lot of times, I would just create a big blank square, and I was like, okay, this is our community, this is the page. And that became this sort of impetus to that started spurring the conversation. Well, I think it needs this, right? This is the most important thing, or this is the most important thing. So people would start getting in there, start dropping sticky notes. They would say, okay, we need this here. And for the folks that weren't comfortable in Miro, because some, of course, will never be fully comfortable in that kind of abstract space. The designer who worked with me, Vivian, and I would start kind of dropping in some of those, oh, I hear what you're saying here. We would drop in those sort of blocks, start to build on it. The benefit of that is that as they see those things that they're talking about come to life, they can say, oh, no, this isn't what I mean, right? And so we're getting actually we're not just getting ideas, right? That's not the purpose of this. We were getting all of these ideas and the feedback on them instantly, right? So they were sharing this thing that was important to them. And then they were able to see, okay, we've reflected back what you were saying. What do you think about that? So sometimes that got, more specific, and we ended up, okay, we can't draw everything we're talking about. So we end up like following this trail of sticky notes forever. Right. And sometimes we like get on really important ideas and another person in that group bounces us somewhere else. So we just have to capture it and move on. It's definitely uncomfortable for researchers, right? I think that we're really used to following our discussion guides. And even when those discussion guides veer off a little bit, nothing is as transparent as having this space that's just this open blank page where your participants can take you to somewhere else that you've never been before. And so it requires a lot of flexibility. I was so lucky to have Vivian, the designer, with me because she was sort of on this journey too, helping to respond and share, helping to elaborate ideas while we would maybe talk about them. So it really became this like chaotic, happy group project that we were building together. And sometimes like those ideas that we were creating were not necessarily things that we're just going to take and put in the site, right? They might not be good ideas. Not every idea is a perfect idea. And we had to prepare our stakeholders inside the organization. We had to say, the purpose of this is not for us to whiteboard on Miro out all these ideas that we can just prioritize and build. We had to sort of train them to look at what's happening on these Miro boards and see, okay, what do people care about? What are we learning that they care about here? Okay, we're learning that the job search on this screen is really important, right? And we know that they want some dialogue here. It's not just, I don't just want a static list of what's important. I want to see it and feel the real people in this. So those are the kinds of insights we were able to pull from going into this kind of depth. We also just had a lot of fun with this, right? It's really important to keep it light, bringing those emojis in, like being silly, right? These were 1.5-hour sessions with people. Sometimes it was really late at night for them because it was after work. So we just kept it really light. We were willing to be silly. We were willing to do stuff that was like not a great idea. So next steps, AKA you had your fun now, right? Because at some point your boss says, okay, you just made a bunch of silly stuff on the whiteboard. What are you doing? What we did as we started pulling this together was we found out, like I said, what our co-creators value, how they made those values become real, and how did it all fit together. So what we did was this Miro experience really helped our design and research team to get in the mindset of this problem space, right? We gained significant depth and saw firsthand how our co-creators put things in order, right? How they jumped from piece to piece. And it really primed us to take on and dig more into this space, right? From here, we went much further into concepts and some more traditional kinds of research. And for those who want to potentially look into co-creation as a research method, we learned a couple of really important things and tried to adjust for it as we went, which is the first is that not all participants are eager to become co-creators, right? This is really uncomfortable for a lot of people. The idea that I'm just going to sign up for a research session and then you're going to make me make art is really challenging. And so it's really important that you prepare for different levels of participation. Sometimes you might have to drive a lot more and sometimes you can drive less. You have to keep people really engaged. You have to ask and prompt and pry the whole time. You have to be a really engaged listener throughout this, and you need a couple of people to take notes so that everyone can sort of be a part of that process. And ultimately, when you're doing this kind of collaboration, that Miro board becomes this shared source of truth where everyone owns it. It's important not to invite people into this Miro board and say, here's this structured flow I have for everyone to go through, right? It has to be willing to be flexible or else they're not going to feel comfortable sharing and participating in that space of trust. That is all I have today. I'd be happy to take questions on this in the future. You can reach out to me in these ways and look forward to the Q&A that we have in this session.
All right. Yeah, feel free to add any questions still, if you have some in the Q&A tab below. Thank you so much, Dan, for sharing all of this with us. And yeah, let's hand it over to Keren for the next presentation.
All right. Thanks, Dan. That was awesome. Dan is a good friend of mine and an ex-colleague, so I really just want to talk to him about what he presented, but I will remain focused on the task at hand. So I'm Keren Toledano. I am a staff product researcher on the messaging team at Shopify, and I'm here to talk to you today about design principles. So great, consistent products require design principles, but it's usually easier said than done. Design principles go by a lot of names. They're also called experience attributes, experience principles, but essentially they are words that describe the experience and core values of a product or a service that your company is offering. So it's really like how you want to make your users feel, the visceral reactions that someone might experience ineffably, unknowably, when interacting with all the components of your design. But how do you craft these for your product? How do you know that you've landed on the right ones? So Lyft, Pinterest, the BBC, here's an example of the types of principles that their teams have landed on. And when you think about the experiences that you've had with these brands, these terms might not come as a surprise to you. And if they do come as a surprise to you, then that might be a hint that these companies are actually not doing a great job at designing with their heuristics in mind. The BBC says they want to be universal. So to them, that means open and accessible. Pinterest says that they want to be animated. To them, that could mean colorful and responsive, full of motion. Lyft says that they want to have you feel confidence in their product, to build trust and consistency and transparency. And so product decisions there should be made in service of these core values. And those decisions can be things like what features you're planning to build. They could be things like small aesthetic improvements or design improvements within your product, even the way you handle data. So at Shopify, we empower commerce at a global scale. We build products, tools, and services for people to start, manage, and scale their businesses. And we manage enormous complexity for commerce giants, as well as giving smaller, newer entrepreneurs the best chances to succeed. There are literally thousands of us working together every single day on different areas of the product. So we need some core values in order to create consistency. So here is a set of physical, tangible product cards, these experience cards, and these exist today at Shopify. The best part about this shared set of values is really the conversations that they enable. They're a fantastic lens through which to view, critique, improve our work. They actually allow us to spend less time discussing design and more time actually doing it. But these are Shopify's sort of generalized experience principles. This is sort of the core values that we hope all areas of Shopify ladder up to. But sometimes generalized experience principles might not be as meaningful to smaller teams or smaller product areas within the company or places within the company that maybe are working with different context, different types of customers. And so that's why on the messaging team, we embarked on creating our own set of experience principles that existed as a subset of Shopify's larger values. So how do we create them? So step one, I want to introduce you to an exercise that I used when I first moved onto the messaging team around 10 months ago. And it helped me to seek alignment with my new teammates, but it also simultaneously helped me to better understand the new product area to which I'd been placed. This product was already in the market. It already existed. It is a business chat communication tool for merchants and shoppers to be able to chat with one another. The team I joined at the time was based in Austin, Texas, San Francisco, California, Toronto, Canada, myself in Philly. And now the team has gotten even larger with folks in Spain and Montreal and Ohio. So not only did we all have differing abilities and amounts of experience working with this messaging tool, we also brought with us differences in time zones, context at Shopify, local cultural customs, and more. And honestly, we just needed something that was consistent among us. In 2002, two researchers named Joey Benedict and Trish Miner introduced something called the Desirability Studies. They were used at that time to measure people's attitudes towards an interface by using a controlled vocabulary set. Basically giving your users a list of reaction words, adjectives usually, and asking them to select words that best describe the design at hand. This was really about capturing first impressions of a product. And this Microsoft study has since been replicated and changed at companies like Intel, eBay, Yahoo, McAfee, really lots of classic Web 1.0 and earlier 2.0 companies. And usually what this would look like would be scales with opposite terms, almost like a survey asking respondents to viscerally define an interface, to apply attitudes and feelings to an interface. And it's really a form of quantitative emotional measurement. So my template and exercise builds upon this practice of desirability studies, but it sort of reverse engineers them a little bit. So instead of having actual users select these terms for us, I thought to myself, like, how could we build a product that works towards a unified reaction? How can we build a product that gets people to feel this adjective? What feelings do we hope our customers have about our product? Using this exercise that I'll show you, we can kind of seed our hopes in the form of words. And as you'll see, this framework can be used to inform or even inspire design direction or as a decision-making rubric for features. So words are currency. Words build worlds. They're sort of one of the first open source, community-driven creations. And if something remains unsaid, it cannot be understood. If we cannot agree on a goal and communicate it, that it's likely we will never achieve it. So at its most basic, this exercise is about giving your teammates a list of product reaction words or adjectives and asking them to select those that best describe the product as it exists today and the product that we would most want to support in the future and the product that we hope we will never become. Which words you include depend on what you're interested in measuring. You can focus on adjectives that describe functionality, content, performance, aesthetics. So think about the goal that you have in mind and what you're optimizing for. And when I think about what terms that could be, if the goal were sort of improving the content of our product, we would use a word like concise, but you generally wouldn't use the word concise when describing visuals. If your goal were about improving functionality, you would probably have a word in here like intuitive, but you wouldn't use the word intuitive to measure something like performance. So think about the words, make sure that the words you're choosing map back to the goal that you have. Make sure you're focusing your adjectives on sort of a set idea. I love this quote. Remember to imagine and craft the worlds you cannot live without, just as you dismantle the worlds you cannot live within. Professor Benjamin's work centers around race, justice, and technology, but they make a point that can really be extrapolated to this exercise, which is the idea of speaking out loud who we do not want to be is as equally important, if not more important, than speaking out loud the happy path, the thing that we hope to engender, the thing that we hope to be, or the thing that we are. So, let's make sure in this exercise that we're not only focusing on sort of the happy future. Let's be honest with ourselves around who we are today. Candor is not cruel. And so for this reason, the exercise that I structured has the columns of we are not, we never hope to be, those sort of various states of potential futures. Step 2 is actually building the board. So I have here these 4 columns that I was talking about. On the left, we have sort of the current state, who we are today. And, this can be informed by customer support feedback, app reviews, previous qualitative or quantitative results. Some places use NPS scores. That's a separate conversation. But essentially, however you measure how customers feel about your product today, have that inform what you're putting here. start wide and refine. We also have the column of who we want to be. This is how we eventually want to be perceived by others. And then we have this sort of torn column, right? Things where it's like, this could go either way. And the we are not column. So cards in that pile are describing who we never hope to become, the future that we never hope arrives. And it's important to talk about why we don't want to be a certain way. So this was an exercise that I had my team do asynchronously. And I really asked them to set aside a decent amount of time for this, about an hour, and start wide and refine down to about 3 cards per column. So it's important to give your team some preparation and understanding on what this exercise is and how it's going to be used. So this is just sort of a little bit of an example of how I did this. I said, this is an exercise that will help us determine the characteristics of X, Y, and Z. We're going to think about these things as we move into how we can express our voice and tone. And I really wanted to make sure and hammer home that this is not the only way that we will make decisions. This is not, so specific that if things are not, expressed in this by these principles, that we won't do them. I wanted to say that this is a reference. This is flexible. This is just going to help us understand where everyone is arriving from. I gave everyone a week to complete this. They had 1 hour. I thought it was really important to invite interdisciplinary colleagues, people that maybe were on different hierarchical levels at the organization, people that were in different crafts at the organization. So, not just UXers, not just researchers, not just product, not just developers. It's important to have differing points of view. I told individuals that they didn't need to use all the cards and so forth. I want to note that the words that you choose, something that I forgot to mention, it's really important to have positive words, neutral words, and negative words. So in the original set that was created in the Microsoft 2002 Desirability Studies, about 40% of the terms were negative. If you only have, happy terms, this is not going to get you very far. This is not an actual reflection of reality. And the original set included something like 118 words. My set that I did had 102. I think you can get away with far fewer, probably 60 or 70. Step 3 is the part where you're doing the work as the facilitator. So I had 8 teammates do this exercise, and I had to set around 2 hours aside where I actually started clustering our answers. So once everyone has responded to the original prompt and filled in their boards, it's your turn to actually cluster them. Where are the areas of agreement in what folks wanted to be? Where are the areas of concern and agreement in what we didn't want to be, who we never want to become? So you start grouping like-minded answers together, with the idea being that if our product can be consistently designed, it can hopefully evoke certain predictable responses in our customers in the future. Here is an example of some of the clusters that I found on the messaging team. A lot of people said that we wanted to be some version of organic, intuitive, simple, right? Those are all sort of complementary, related, similar terms that ladder up to the idea of ease, instinct. Several people brought up the idea of being, modern, current, progressive. We actually sussed out and talked about what those terms mean to us. But it's important to group these so that when you have the live portion of the exercise and everyone comes back to have a conversation, you can actually show them, hey, isn't it great? We had some areas of really high agreement. We had some areas where maybe let's talk about this a little bit more. Maybe we're all coming at this from different understanding of our product, and it's important to elevate those. So you have a synchronous conversation. You have them explain what adjectives personally mean to them, ask teammates why they believe that the principles are important to the future of our product. It's important that you record this session, take copious notes, because this is going to serve as the base for your actual principles, and provide some conversation starters like, what are examples of how we currently fulfill these attributes today? Describe a time that the product actually made you feel this way. What are examples of how we can actually fulfill this attribute? Once you've had that big conversation, you've let everyone say their piece about why they have or have not chosen certain words, the dot voting begins. For a more anonymized, less power dynamic driven dot voting, you can give everyone the same color dot, the same weighted value, the same number of votes. You can actually have people schedule when their dot voting is going to happen. So maybe immediately following the session, you schedule someone to have 15 minutes of dot voting, then the next person, then the next person. And in that way, participants will not be watched, even if the cursors are off. No one will be in the same board at the same time. Tally it all up. Here's an example of what our boards looked like. You can, it's up to you what frame you think is more interesting for you. The frame can be the who we want to be, who we are not, who we are. You can use all of them, none of them. You know your product best. You know what will resonate with your team. So that's up to you. And then you sum it all up into a concise little document. So like in a jazz ensemble, when adhering to these principles, each teammate is still given plenty of room to improvise. All players are sort of coming from a common context and understanding. We can all perform and carefully listen to one another and respond to one another with the sort of shared complementary melody in mind that will allow us to all be sort of individually creative in our own way. So we landed on wanting to be natural, informed, and goal-oriented. We actually further defined out what those things mean to us. We don't have time to go through these now, but they've been really important in helping us create an ethos and a culture on our team. And then finally, arguably the most important part of this is going on a road show. Speak about these ad nauseum during design crits, become seriously obnoxious about them. Adoption of these principles will take time. A routine in a single person takes like 2 to 3 weeks of consistency to click, whether that's like a new exercise regimen or you're trying a new diet or something like that. It takes even longer in groups of people. Don't be discouraged if you're the only person bringing these up during decision-making times. Just keep reminding people like, hey, we decided these together. This is not me speaking unilaterally. This is us speaking from the past to the future. You can also use these to make a rubric that rates decisions by adherence to these principles. You can go back to those original desirability studies and actually ask users to rate your product on the scales to see if you're like moving closer or further from your principles. There's a lot of things that you could do with these words once you've agreed on them. So that is it for me. I have the original board to show as well, but I don't know if we have time for that. Any questions?
Cannot see any questions here, but thank you so much for providing all these insights. Also, I just wanted to share with everyone that the session is being recorded and it will be published a bit later on YouTube. So if you want to get deep dive into one of these presentations and get some tips, you can do it on YouTube. For now, thanks again, Keren, and I'll hand it over to Roger.
Thanks so much.
I can see the questions coming in thick and fast, so I'm assuming I'm going to pick that up just after this. Hi, my name is Roger, and I decided to challenge myself and actually do this presentation in Miro, seeing as it's Miro, so this is going to be fun. I think taking screenshots of massive Miro boards was a bit of a challenge, so I switched over to this. So let's see how this goes. My name is Roger. I'm from Founders Factory Africa. So in short, you can find me or Founders Factory on most social medias, but really what Founders Factory Africa is a corporate venture builder that we're building African startups. And so we invest in and build about 20 different African startups per year. We have 2 programs, a build, which is an early stage program, and a scale program. which is the later stage, slightly later stage businesses, still all pre-seed. So it's a lot of working with startups. We invest $200 to $500 in cash and services. And services is the component where we sit in. So we have growth and product and engineering and investments and team and and talent and things. And these are a bunch of startups that we've worked with. But really, to that title slide of consistency, customized consistency, we sit with this problem in that we have a really wide range of services that we deliver, and every startup that comes into our program needs a very different type of support. But at the same time, we need to create consistencies in what we're actually building and how we're doing that. So what I'm going to run you through is some of the journey that we are very much still going on in how we provide customized consistency to this range of startups that come through, and how we use Miro for that. So the first place where I started was just mapping out all of the different services that we do. So this is specifically intentionally zoomed out because there's a lot going on. But I really mapped out just all of the things that we'd done with previous startups, and that possible activities was all the possible things that we could have done with them at any individual stage. And zooming in, those are things like business model canvases or financials or name and branding, or moving forward into the later stages, it's designs or prototypes. And these are all various different workshops or activities that we needed to build. And so we started working with various different startups and defining these things and kind of diving in. And there's quite a wide range of teams and types of support that we needed. And what it resulted in is Miro boards that look like this, or Miro boards that look like this, that were super organized and laid out. But what we found is, we kept using different tools and different templates for various different components. I'll zoom into a couple a bit further down the line. But what we realized relatively quickly is every time we started, we found ourselves going back to previous boards and copying pieces, or trying to use a template that we then have to try and change and modify in each startup, or each time we have to dive into it. And it's sort of same but different. We're doing the similar types of workshops and similar types of activities, but every startup has a slightly different need. There's a slightly different nuance. Sometimes you do some of the workshops beforehand, some of it's later, like things like custom interviews could happen almost anywhere in the process. And defining mapping experiments started becoming a bit of a challenge on how we actually do that consistently. And the other thing is, working across a range of startups, we found ourselves often different team members would step in or step out if they were specialists in a certain area. And it made it really difficult to try and just get the context of where you're at every time you're doing it. Most of our product team works across 3 to 5 startups at a time. And it might be right in there helping do custom interviews, it might be running workshops, or it might just be doing a bit of advisory or coordination role on that. And we were just reinventing ourselves on the fly way too often. And on reflection and unpacking this, what I realized is, looking through all these different activities, startups don't need linear support. It doesn't go from left to right. You don't always do all these activities only at certain stages. We were often finding businesses at the launch stage, or they had a product in the market, but they needed to actually launch a new product, or they wanted to move to a new market. And that meant they had to move right back to the beginning and do a number of a bit more research or unpacking on that side. And so what we ultimately came up with is classic product principles. It's around the outcomes, not the content. And so what we started reflecting on is, what is the startup trying to do? What is the outcome that they're trying to achieve? Be it validate customer needs. And then there was a series of different workshops or activities that we could do of this. And so instead of focusing on a workshop level and building templates and frameworks around that, we started building sort of the outcome and a process, and focusing on these little mini modules. And it became a lot clearer as to, so the customer interviews you can use in both the B2B sales pipeline or in the validating customer needs pipeline, but it's more around identifying what that collection is and then building consistency through the activities in how we do that. And so when a startup comes in now, the sort of kickoff week or the scoping that we do is to try and identify what are the outcomes they need to achieve in the next 6 months. And then we work backwards from there to play the mini playbooks of what the different workshops we run to actually look at that. So we started like this, taking that framework and mapping all the different tools of where they needed to go. But like I said, it still became quite independent. Some of these tools, like is standard Miro templates, like for hypothesis mapping. Some of them are pulled off other providers like Strategizer, value proposition canvases or test cards. And some of them are things that we've sort of developed and been modeling and updating ourselves. This is an iteration design to help map future iterations of a product as it goes. And so we've got these range of different tools, but when it really started clicking for us was when we tied things into a process. So this is our branding collection. When somebody needs to do a branding workshop, this is the process we run them through. So we'll start at the top, and there's an overview here of the types of things we might do. But this is sort of the central pool that we run from that might have some brand workshops, some values, some competitor landscape, how they're positioning and thinking. And then we move down into competitor assessment, so dropping screenshots in and doing assessments. And these become a series of workshops that we might run over anything from a 1 to 6 week process with a startup. And what this looks like in practice is, so this was one of the startups that we actually worked on. They didn't need a full brand, they already had some, and it was mostly just a tweaking. So here we kind of unpacked what this would mean for them, sort of what synonyms are related to their chosen word or what resonates with them. I'm not sure why that copy isn't pulling through. And you can kind of help the brand identify that. And then we dig into competitor analysis and pulling screenshots of different competitors, what we like, what we don't like about that. And it made it a lot easier. This was actually all delivered by one of our junior designers this was the first project he kind of ran in, but he had enough of a template so we could walk him through the template that he could dive in and actually get through sort of color brand inspirations and ending all the way down with sort of the full sort of mock-ups of redesigns with the logo redesign and where we actually ended. And so working in these clusters has helped us create much more consistency as we move between projects and has helped empowered more junior employees to actually deliver the same kind of value. And so zooming out a little bit, this is the full board of that particular startup with the branding section happened in the middle. This was doing user flows and improvements of their current flow. There's value proposition of different customer segments that moves into it's changed as the Zoom has changed, but it's moved into sort of stakeholder maps and assumptions and hypotheses. So by creating these little clusters of events, of tools, we've created a lot more consistency in how we can support the startups. And to take this one step further, what we've started developing or putting together is a bit more content. So it's a content hub that we're actually going to open source, and we're collaborating with a number of other accelerators. And this is sort of pre-reading for entrepreneurs before they come into a session. So this is what one of those might look like. And in these tools and templates, there's actually a link to a Miro board with a set of templates that will apply to this piece of work and how they do that. So we're looking at how we systematize and scale the types of support. So at least the entrepreneur can do some pre-reading before the session. And then when we dive in, it's all working off a consistent framework of what we were trying to deliver. And while we were going through this, so this is still a work in progress. I'm hoping that the African Startup Hub will be live by the end of this year, early next year. And really, we're working with a number of different accelerators for that. But in doing this, we also realized there was one other issue that we were getting stuck on, and that's we were repeating ourselves quite a lot, often at the same time. We currently have about 15 startups, 13 to 15 startups active at any given point. And so we're often running a lot of the same workshops at the same time. So another thing we've been experimenting with is to run sort of group workshops where we have a central process. So the central space in the middle is what the person running the workshop will walk you through. And each startup picks a template on the side. The star diagram is just to help orientate people when they get a little lost. And so what we'll do is the person leading the workshop will share their screen, share a screen on the Zoom call, so people can really follow along and see what's happening, and see at any point they can switch to Zoom and see the content that's been delivered. But at the same time, they have their own little space where they're building out their content and they're working on that. And it's quite useful at each point to then have the participants reflect on what stood out for them at this particular point, what was insight, what they changed. And that often helps the group work together but separate in how they do that. And so all of these two things, one working through focusing on modules or series of workshops instead of individual workshops and building templates around that. And then the content repository around how we sort of prime them for those workshops to be more effective. And then lastly, to be able to run group workshops like this are the three big ways that we're trying to create consistency for our startups across, but while keeping it custom. So everyone gets very custom support, but we can pull them together and deliver still the right kind of support for what they need, but in a very standardized way. And that's how we're using Miro and what we're up to at Founders Factory. Back to Lynn.
Yes, I'll take it over. Thank you so much, Roger, for sharing all of this with us. Yeah, no questions came in here. I'll maybe give a couple of seconds for anyone to add a question in the chat. Otherwise, yeah, I'll jump back to the questions again after Juan has completed his presentation. Yeah, I see there were some questions for Keren, which I'll jump back to later on. Thank you so much again. And Juan, over to you.
Thanks, Lynn. I want to thanks to Dan, Keren, and Roger. It's been great. And I think I have a couple of things in my presentation that actually reflect some of the great things that we learned about co-creation, working on values, and also about how to distribute the work across the team to actually do that. So for that, I'm gonna share my screen. So hopefully you can see this. So I'm Juan. I joined Miro 1 year ago. And actually, I think this is gonna be the presentation with the less Miro words from today, actually, which is actually quite interesting. But basically, I'm gonna talk a bit about how we use empathy within Miro. So one thing I noticed when I joined is like we had like 10 million users, which now it's like 25 million users that we have, which means like everything is scaling and the speed. So we have product designers, but we also have designers in many different areas, then in digital, the branding, researchers, content designers, educational designers. So the need for design is growing in different phases. But also, the complexity of the use cases that we're serving, like, for instance, covering the enterprise and growth, different use cases that we are optimizing for, they are taking care of the core team. So everything is growing at the same pace. So one thing I noticed is looking at the whole team, what I noticed is the empathy and how we build around this is kind of like a common thread. And it's one of the main drivers that we have as a team to celebrate how users and customers are using our product. So, I mean, I've been lucky because over my career, I've been using empathy as a driver for me and to my advantage. I did many different ways to build empathy with users, from focus groups to meetings with the stakeholders when you engage them into, as Dan was mentioning, like getting people into primary school again, or even running remote or on-site usability studies, or to actually fun experiences like surveying task force for London, traveling in public. So actually doing it, just being like a TFL employee, so I can actually get on-hands experience from that. But also like going to an event booth to promote a tool that we were working on. So that way we can actually understand the questions that people were asking, which help us to build actually the website for the product with clear answers. So from that, actually going back to the empathy being one of the main core values that we have at Miro. So basically how we can use empathy to gain more knowledge about what we're building. It's not only something that it gets into just part of our culture, and that's it. It's all something that we celebrate. So we have all culture champions. So we make sure that people that really empower our values are celebrated. And I think this is something that I haven't come across in my experience before, but I think it's really powerful because it empowers the whole team to be taking care of these values on the day-to-day, which is actually really important. So to go for instance, concrete examples, we have every Friday what we call Friday Wins, which is basically teams presenting all the great things that we're launching. And something I noticed is like everything starts from defining what's the user problem that we're solving and how we're going to improve the lives of our users with this. And every single presentation that we have, I'm on the team. And the cool thing is like it's a rolling thing. So it could be a designer, engineer, tester, or a salesperson or marketing or anyone from the team. Is always kind of the same kind of pattern. So it's always talking from what have we learned from users that we actually improve in their lives. We also have the voice of the customer, which is like a monthly session where we actually hear from not only from product, because historically you think about, oh, learning from users is only from the product side, but we have folks from sales, from marketing, telling us their different perspectives, different points of view on how we're learning our customers about maybe enabling the account and maybe creative about that. So it's actually giving more like a 360 view about not just only on the product side, but also on the sales and other areas that may not have as much attention or airtime for product teams, which is great. And something we do very frequently every day using tools like Bloom or Blossom, which is like a repository for research, where we share openly in a Slack anything that we learn from users. So we have a good library of reports, videos, so we can actually refer back to that. And this is really powerful because everyone can have access to this library, which kind of opens the empathy and gaining that we can get from these assets. And something that we do more, this is more operational, but something I noticed since I joined is like, I can count the weeks where we normally have like 2 to 3 engagements with users. And I think this is really powerful because when you're designing solutions for millions of users, sometimes having these perspectives open your eyes so to different use cases you haven't thought before, or you learn a new way of using the product that you haven't been experienced before. But obviously there are teams like in our organization that are not able to access to users as easily. Like if you think for enterprise segment, historically it's always more complex to get access to those. So for instance, I know that my enterprise design folks, they've found a way to actually shortcut the need to recruit enterprise users. And actually this end up in a kind of like a focus group activity that end up with tripling the customer satisfaction they have from their core audience, which is really cool. So it's actually this drive to gain empathy is something that I think is really powerful. But also, like, for instance, in meetings and workshops, we work very frequently with our pro community of facilitators. So basically like a Slack community where we actually can exchange ideas, ask questions, get their thoughts. And the cool thing is like, it's just one click away to an enormous amount of wisdom that we have from this community. And something that we hear from Dan before, which is about the power of co-creations. So for us, for example, when we are building new experiences, we also do co-creation not only for the internal team, but also with users. So for instance, we can take facilitators that we know they are quite heavily involved maybe in organizing workshops for longer days, and we map out the journey, and we also try to map the journey before and then co-creating with them like what areas are missing and what areas they think are problems that they would like to solve, or even validate journeys that we have been working on with them, and creating ideas about how we solve these problems and get them to prioritize, okay, these are the higher problems, and then brainstorm with them into the prioritized list that we come across. And obviously, something that coming back to the scale of the solutions and the scaling of the problems, something that we think in the meetings and workshops team that is really powerful is to shorten the feedback loops, which means is get solutions out there to learn faster. So we have been experimenting with different two kind of initiatives, like having regular design sprints when we have something that is not actually really defined, to help us to shorten and close this loop as early as possible. And something that we are experimenting lately is more about having learning sessions every day, every Friday. So we actually can learn from the team, and not only from product or just design and research. It's from engineering, marketing, like things that we learn from our users, share it with the wider team, so everyone can get informed, and actually will help us to build this shared understanding that it's gonna help us to design a better future of the product. And just to close this off, basically, we treat empathy as something that we do as a collective. So it's not like an individual ownership, and we build it as a team sport. So I think that's pretty much it. So thanks, everyone. And yeah, I'm gonna pass it to questions if we have any, or if not, we will start asking questions from the previous hosts.
Yes, so I see there are a couple of questions coming in. Let's just start with the ones for Keren first. Yeah, there was a request to show your board, and also what group sizes worked well for the exercises that you were talking about.
Okay, I will share my board. It's not the filled out board because that has personally identifiable information, but I did some sort of like modified template where if you zoom out, number one was that asynchronous portion where everyone fills out the board on their own that I was talking about. Number two is the portion where you sort of converge and you group all the sort of Post-its and things that people chose based on the 4 columns, we are not. And then the third board is the third frame is like the sync together, where we actually have those thought starters and talk about who we want to become and why, and agree on sort of our final set of principles. And I have little reminders throughout this where it's like, hey, avoid words that are a great baseline for all products, right? Like everyone wants to be usable. Everyone wants to be consistent. Everyone, there's things that like are just table stakes that are not unique and valuable in and of themselves. So I had these little like reminders throughout the set. And here, let's just see, let's go to fake teammate 4. I had the attribute cards that I had chosen for my purposes. This was like that 100 and change cards. They're sort of antonyms of each other, or sort of opposite scales of each other. And then you have people drag those into their appropriate categories and select from, only one of these words. And everyone did that asynchronously. And then this was the grouping of the things and the dot voting of the things. I did this on my own and actually took notes on sort of what people were saying about why they chose these words and putting those in context with the words. Yeah. And then once we agreed on our final rounds, this left Miro and went into a paper document, and then eventually cards, tangible cards of their own. And in terms of how many people this exercise could be good for, I did it with 8. I think 10 and under is probably a good number, an arbitrary number that I just chose, but I do think it can become unwieldy in terms of analysis of, grouping all of those cards together, in terms of finding levels of agreement, and just time. The more people you have in a meeting, the longer it takes, kind of thing. And the more people you have in a meeting, the less people are willing to be sort of vulnerable and actually share their true thoughts. So I would keep it into a sort of more intimate group. If you have a larger team, you can actually run several of these, with a smaller, more intimate group, and then combine them later.
Great. Thank you, Keren. Yeah, I'm just going to read out the questions as they came in. So the next one is from David to Dan. Did co-creation during the research phase lead to co-creation during the design phase? And if so, did it make it easier to co-create during the design phase?
Yeah, this is a really good question. Thanks, Dave, and thanks for joining. We actually, this particular example actually became part of like a pitch to have this project taken on in full, because it is kind of a departure for Stack Overflow, and it was successful. I mean, 2022 planning pending, it was successful. So we haven't actually gotten into that phase yet, but it definitely was super well received. I think people really liked the depth and difference that we got from that research, and we're actually running another set of co-creation sessions as research in December. So I think it is definitely fueled momentum towards that idea.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I'm just jumping back to the chat just so I make sure that I go over all the questions. So for Juan, can you give an example of the design sprints you have talked about, or go a bit more into detail on that? Sounds interesting. Question from Edward.
Yeah, thanks, Edward. So for instance, like as you can imagine, hybrid is becoming like a popular term these days. So for instance, something that we have been thinking in Miro is like, you know, ideas about hybrid and stuff, and also like some features that we launched recently, like for instance, this smart meetings, which was released like a couple of weeks ago on a beta stage. So basically, we use the design sprint as a tool for starting to validate ideas early. So it's just, as maybe most of you will be familiar, but it's just like a 5-day technique. It was created by Jack Knapp. Basically, you have 1 day to create a vision, then to start ideating, and then the idea is at the end of the week, you do like prototyping and testing this idea with 5 customers, so you can actually get validation of your idea. Obviously, it's not like a final yes or no, but it's to give you traffic light signals about what you've been learning about that, and to get you faster, because for some organizations might be challenging to just get that on a week. But yeah, and I think that's really interesting topic. And if you want to learn more, maybe just email me at juan@miro.com and we can continue that, because yeah, it could be lengthy to explain.
Cool. Thank you, Juan. Yeah, there's also another question from Dina. I haven't heard of Blossom. How do you use it?
Yes, so Blossom is a repository that we have for snippets of research. So basically, it's like a library. So this way, our research team can give us links to actually videos or small segments of interviews. So it can share with the team. It can be shared even on Miro board if you want. So you can actually use it for when you're working on whatever design. So basically, it's like a way to give you a snippet. Oh, this user is talking about this specific problem. So you can share it through Blossom, and it's actually really insightful to have that at your fingertips, actually.
Thank you. And there is another question in the Q&A. For remote workshop, will you request people to open the camera?
Yeah, this pretty much everyone from I'm gonna start and then I'm gonna pass it to Roger, and then we do it like that.
That's good.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna answer with the most designer question you can imagine. It depends, but sometimes if you're doing like a heavy loaded activity, probably video doesn't matter, because maybe you are into the zone of doing the activity. But other times, if you're trying to read what people are, you know, the feelings and stuff, it will be easier to have the camera. But I wouldn't say it's something that you really need for every workshop.
Yeah, so with us, we're almost everything we do is remote because the startups are all over the place. But I generally, I completely agree with Juan. It depends. I'm generally for smaller groups where it's less of a workshop-y thing. If you're all focused on the Miro board, then you turn the cameras off. But if you're actually trying to engage with people, it's still really important to have that human side. So I like to use, like if it's a small workshop and you want lots of engagement, cameras on, microphones off, unless there's background noise. I just find it helps the conversations flow a lot better. People can actually just speak when they have something to say instead of trying to find that mute button, which is in the back corner, and you've probably got something else selected. So to keep people focused, keep people engaged, I generally prefer that, but you don't always want that. So it kind of depends.
Anything to add, Keren?
I think it just depends on the circumstance, but more and more lately, I'm very happy to have sessions with camera off. I think there's like a little bit of remote fatigue that's been happening. I think sometimes people tend to be a little bit more honest or sort of off the cuff if you have the camera off, but it really, like Juan is saying, like it depends. Like there are nonverbal cues that for certain types of research are really important to pick up on and notate and annotate in your field notes. So yeah, it's not a straight answer, but I'd say it really depends.
I definitely agree with everything that was already said. The only thing I'll add is from a research perspective, one thing we have been doing, especially in the past year, is saying upfront, if you ever need to take a second away, you don't even need to explain, just turn your camera off and step away from the computer, whether even if that's one-on-one or in a small group. I think we do need to honor everyone's family situations or whatever. And so if you can do that and set the precedent, I think it's a really good inclusion to your workshops.
All right. No more questions. So I think we're just gonna wrap it up. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And I hope you have learned something that you can take with you. I'm just gonna mention again that the recording will be shared on YouTube after editing. And also a big thank you to Dan, Keren, and Roger for sharing your insights. It's been a pleasure having you all here today and working with you. And before you all go, I also have a quick little survey or feedback survey that you can, if you have some time, just have a quick look. Hope to see you all again next time.